It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
Has one of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Beth Kerr. I'm the Group Director of Wellbeing for the Global Schools Group Cognita. We are proud wellbeing partners for the Festival of Education again this year, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for the session, Suzi Godson. Now, Suzi wears many hats. She is a psychologist, journalist, author and designer, but today she is taking the stage in her role as co-founder of Me Too Education, a multi-award-winning social enterprise which specialises in developing creative, cost-effective, scalable mental health solutions for young people. In 2017, Me Too Education launched Me Too, a pre-moderated, anonymous peer support app which teaches young people how to help themselves by helping each other. The app currently supports over 50,000 young people and is part of the NHS Apps Library in the UK. This month, Me Too has launched Me Too Connect, a free, safe, anonymous peer support app for anyone working in education. I have had the pleasure of working with Suzi and Me Too for some time now, and can also say that as well as being an incredible advocate for children's well-being, she is just a thoroughly lovely person. And so, without further ado, I will hand over to Suzi for what I know will be a wonderful presentation. Suzi, over to you.
Thank you. Right, now I just have to work out how to...
Sharing screen, yes.
Yep. There we go.
Brilliant.
I can't see my slides though. Sorry.
No, don't worry. This is the trickiest bit of all.
Where's that? Can you see them?
Yeah, I can see them.
They're not coming up on my screen.
Perhaps we get a bit.
Okay.
Perhaps we can get some technical help, because I'm not sure I can talk through these slides.
Suzi, if you go down to the bottom of the screen, so you've got the sort of taskbar with the applications, and just click on the PowerPoint application, that should then bring up your slides for you.
Well, that didn't work. So I should share screen, click on the window. Okay, sorry. Thank you for bearing with me. So this presentation focuses on understanding self-harm, and I'm going to be using qualitative and quantitative data from the Me Too app to illustrate the research that we're looking at and to help you understand the origins, predictors, prevalence, and motivations for self-harm. It's based on the newest research around self-harm, and then at the end there's going to be some suggestions for what you can do to help prevent self-harm in your school. Self-harm is not a new phenomenon by any means. This chart is from Sarah Cheney's doctorate on self-mutilation and psychiatry, 1864 to 1914. pretty niche, and it shows how references to self-mutilation began appearing in medical journals like the Lancet and the British Medical Journal in about the 1850s, and then increased in prevalence up until a peak in 1900. On the left, from the same doctorate, you can see the references to self-harm in the Bethlehem Hospital for the Mentally Ill in London between 1880 and 1900. And on the right, you can see an online poll about primary methods of self-injury that ran in about 2004. And what's amazing is the parallels between the two images, and you can see that the same types of self-harm appear in both diagrams: biting, burning, cutting, skin picking, hair plucking. These are types of self-harm that we see in every school nowadays, but were also present in the 1800s. But self-harm goes back much further than that. It was first mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus, and in the Middle Ages, religious flagellants would whip themselves until they bled, and the pain of this self-punishment was believed to be a way of controlling emotions, which I think also has parallels with the way we view self-harm now. In East Asia, self-burning, including things like burning the fingers off, was a form of devotion. And in the 1960s, self-immolation became a form of religious protest. Everybody really knows about scarification and tribalism, which dates back to the Bronze Age and has been found on artifacts from the Bronze Age. It's essentially decorative, but it's also about social inclusion and identity, and being part of a particular clan. In the first half of the 20th century, all deliberate acts of self-harm were interpreted as attempted suicide, and that was actually a criminal offence until 1961. So it's ironic that within a decade, the tools of self-harm had become the iconography of punk. The safety pin and the razor blade were, according to Johnny Rotten, a nod to tribalism, but Sid Vicious was a notorious self-harmer. It was only really in the 90s that self-harm started to be viewed through the lens of mental health. And another musician, Richie Edwards from the Manic Street Preachers, was one of the first musicians to be really open about his depression and mental health. And he caused a sort of press furore when he self-harmed in front of the journalist Steve Lamacq during a conversation. And he required 17 stitches. In 2012, Miley Cyrus was one of many celebrities who started sporting self-harm scars. And at that point, it did feel as if self-harm had gone mainstream. And certainly between 2000 and 2014, rates of self-harm had trebled. I think everybody knows that self-harm is a coping mechanism, and that most people who self-harm don't actually want to die. But when self-harm starts to become a fashion statement, we need to be very, very careful. Although suicide is the leading cause of death for young people in the UK, it's still relatively rare. There are 11 million people under the age of 25 in the UK, and only around 450 deaths by suicide in that age group. However, more than half of all young people who die by suicide have a history of self-harm. And Keith Horton's research shows that in the 12 months after an act of self-harm that requires presentation at hospital, the risk of suicide in 10 to 18-year-olds is 31 times higher than it is in the rest of the general population of that age. So what that means is that non-fatal self-harm has to always be taken seriously, particularly if it requires a hospital attendance, because it is the strongest single risk factor for completed suicide. Prevalence on self-harm is quite difficult because it's secret and it's stigmatized, and people don't generally want to talk about it. So there's a variation in the prevalence. The Millennium Cohort study estimates that about 1 in 3 girls by the age of 17 has self-harmed, and about 1 in 5 males. A large scale, well, it was about 1,000 people polled by YouGov with the charity Self-Harm UK, The Mix and Young Minds, found an overall rate of 36% of young people aged 16 to 25, and 24% were male. But other research, academic research, suggests that around as many as 45% have tried self-harm at some point. This slide looks at what young people expect to achieve when they self-harm. We know that it's a coping mechanism, and the primary goal is tension relief, but you can see here pretty obviously that the aim of self-harm is to reduce unpleasant feelings. It's not to experience pleasure or to get a kick or a high. It also things like self-punishment and regaining awareness of physical sensations. That's a theme that comes up over and over again when you will look at the posts from young people. And this diagram, which is from the same study, looks at the outcomes, what happens after somebody self-harms. So the black lines are how someone is feeling before they self-harm, and the grey lines are how someone feels after they self-harm. And you can see it's quite a significant shift. So although the aim is to reduce unpleasant feelings, and that does work, there's a huge reduction in tension and pressure, but there's also a significant increase in feeling relaxed, feeling relieved, and feeling alive. However, we also see an increase in shame. And over here you can see that levels of guilt don't really change very much. So there is, this mechanism isn't really fully understood, but it's thought that self-harming releases endorphins in the brain, and this gives rise to a sort of temporary euphoria, but it doesn't last. Of course, what happens to young people is that they become reliant on that temporary relief, and then when things get difficult again, they go back to self-harm. This is a quote from a 13-year-old Me Too user who describes the addictive properties of self-harm, and that it's not really addiction, it's a cycle of relief, distress, guilt and shame in the middle. Predictors of self-harm, they're so multiple and there's so many different ones, but a recent study suggests that it's by a team at the University of Cambridge, and they explored the emotional and behavioural characteristics of young people who reported self-harming at 14. And they suggest that the predictors of self-harm, it can be predicted up to 10 years before it actually manifests or requires treatment. And one of the most common factors was sleep problems. And you can see here in this post from an 11-year-old Me Too user that we see this all the time in the app. You know, kids as young as 5 can have trouble getting to sleep or has trouble staying asleep. And then obviously this affects their capacity to deal with stress. One of the other major factors was low self-esteem. Of course, low self-esteem can be caused by all sorts of different things. It can be based on personality, it can be genetic, environmental, or it can be caused by bullying. But it has a huge impact on young people, and it makes them more vulnerable to self-harm. You can see here that this young person is really scared of the social situation at school and self-harming as a way of coping. And they're just age 12. Bullying is strongly associated with both non-suicidal and suicidal self-harm. So obviously stamping it out should be a #1 priority for all schools. And this post from a 15-year-old Me Too user explains how they they started self-harming when they were bullied at school 3 years previously, and they had just managed to get clean or to stop self-harming when the bullying started again, and now they're slipping back into old habits. But as this person explains, it does make them feel better in a weird way. And that is the trap of self-harm. The fact that it does provide some relief means that young people go back to it time and again. Young people who self-harm are often already suffering with mental health issues such as depression or anxiety. They're also more likely to have parents with mental health issues or parents who self-harm. And this post from a young person who is depressed describes how the sort of anhedonia, the numbness and the emptiness that comes from depression, and then self-harming becomes a way to cope. It sort of jolts them back into themselves for a short time. Self-harm's also related to difficult life events. It's related to separation, divorce, family conflict. And when you consider that 1 in 2 marriages in the UK breaks down, I mean, that's a horrible statistic when you tag it onto self-harm. This young person is 14. You know, we as adults take things like separation relatively casually, but we don't really recognize the impact that it has on young people. This young person already self-harms, and that may have been as a result of emerging family conflict. And now that her parents are finally breaking up, her self-harm is becoming worse. We have lots of very vulnerable young people who are living in care or living in very difficult circumstances. This young person is a young carer who's struggling to look after their dad, and self-harm is their way of coping. Exam stress is a massive issue. This young person who's 15 started to self-harm during their mocks and is still self-harming 4 months later. The relationship between self-harm and suicide around exam stress is worth noting. In Lewis Appleby's study of suicide in children and young people, 5 suicides happened in the week after an exam. Adolescents who are diagnosed with ADHD are at a greatly increased risk of self-harm and suicidality, and it's particularly true for girls, who tend to be diagnosed much later, if at all. And researchers now think that the link between self-harm and ADHD in girls is so strong that it may actually be the first obvious indicator. And they believe that there is a case to be made for automatic ADHD screening for girls who present as self-harming. This is from an 11-year-old, and you can see the confusion of understanding that they have a diagnosis of ADHD, but self-harming and just feeling just generally incredibly confused. Young people who are LGBT are 2 to 3 times more likely to self-harm. And in Lewis Appleby, in that same study by Lewis Appleby into suicide by children and young people, 24% of young people who had died by suicide were LGBT. And as you all know, despite all the awareness, young people who are LGBT are still bullied in school and discriminated against, and this compounds all the risk factors for self-harm. Contagion is also an issue. Exposure to self-harm in a peer group is a risk factor for a young person self-harming themselves. And it makes sense. If the supposedly cool kids in your class are doing something, then the perceived benefit of joining in is inclusion. Sarah Jane Blakemore explains smoking using this cost-benefit analysis. Although teenagers know that smoking causes cancer at some point in the distant future, not smoking right now leads to immediate social exclusion, and that's a much greater risk for a teenager. In this post from a 12-year-old, you can see how a multiplication of all the factors. So you have social contagion in that her friend already cuts herself and she now does it too, but they're in a same-sex relationship and her parents don't know. And you can understand how those multiple stresses would just be so too much for a 12-year-old to cope with. Impulsivity is also a risk factor for self-harm. Drugs and alcohol, and especially cannabis use, is associated with self-harm. And I mean, this particular post illustrates the relationship between sensation seeking and self-harm. And some of these issues are occupational hazards for young people, but it's just a reminder of the need for education around safety. When posts come into the Me Too app, they are tagged not just under one topic, but under multiple topics. So for example, this post would be tagged under self-harm because of the cutting. It would be tagged under school because it's talking about teaching. It would be tagged under depression because of the fact that they're depressed, and it would also be tagged under parents. And if we look at posts about self-harm and look at the most frequently co-tagged topics, you get an interesting picture of the issues that correspond to self-harm. Relapse is the #1 issue, and that relates to the fact that self-harm goes hand in hand with feelings of guilt and shame. Young people who do it, they want to stop and they try to stop, but they often fail. So it's really important that they get the support that they need to keep trying. But you can see here that all the issues that we've just looked at, issues around friends, social inclusion, mental health, depression, school, self-esteem, and not being able to talk about things, they all come up in the co-tagging. If we look at this word cloud, excuse me, you can see also if this looks at the sort of top 20 co-tagged posts around self-harm, things like body image and appearance and relationships, and also suicide and recovery are also there. So by exploring our data, by taking a single topic and looking at what comes up in relation to it in our data set, we get a much broader picture of what's really going on. Gender is another issue. You probably know that girls are 3 times more likely to self-harm than boys. And you probably know that boys are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than girls. But actually, it's really important to try and unpack that data, because it's not really accurate. In boys, when girls self-harm, they're more likely to do things like cut or self-poisoning. And when they end up in A&E, it's pretty obvious that they need a psychiatric assessment. However, for boys, gender roles and stigma around mental health make it much harder for them to ask for help. And it's also true that they self-harm in different ways. They're more likely to punch walls or to drink heavily, to take risks, to exercise to the point of punishment, to take drugs, or to control their eating. And when a young male turns up at A&E having punched a wall or drunk a bottle of vodka, he's not asked about underlying issues or given a psychiatric assessment. Depending on the extent of his injury, he's either sent home or he's referred to a fracture clinic where his physical injuries will improve, but his mental health won't. And this graph that you're looking at comes from a 2017 study by the pediatric mental health team at the Whittington Hospital. And they reviewed all the medical records of young people under 18 who presented at A&E over the course of a year. And the results showed that 44% of boys presenting with punch injuries were either discharged without any follow-up, and 43% were referred to a fracture clinic. But if you look down at the bottom, you'll see that there were absolutely no referrals for psychiatric support. Because it's much harder for boys to ask for help, we've specifically designed Me Too to make it gender neutral. We've taken out all the visual hierarchies. It's completely anonymous. And we also target boys very specifically in our advertising, because we know that when it comes to mental health, girls will ask for help, but boys definitely won't. And it's working as a strategy because 40% of our users are boys, which is something that we're incredibly proud of. And as a result of having a more equal demographic in the app, we also don't see that 3-to-1 ratio on self-harm. As you can see from posts in 2020, the ratio between male and female posting around self-harm is almost equal. And because disclosing your gender is optional, it's almost certain that many of the people who tag others or other in the option are also male. So, when do young people start to self-harm? So studies from all over the world consistently find that rates of self-harm increase at about the age of 12 during the transition to adolescence, and then begin to decline when young people are about 21. And that is exactly what we see in the Me Too app. You can see here that each bar corresponds to the age of the child. So age 11, people start posting about self-harm, and then that gradually increases and it peaks at the age of 13 and then begins to tail off until it gets to about 25, when it's virtually negligible. 2011 research by Paul Moran and colleagues, he repeatedly surveyed children who self-harmed from the age of 14 to the age of 29. And he also found that participants who had self-harmed in adolescence, 9 out of 10 reported no self-harm in adulthood, and cutting in particular became less common. And that's really important, because although self-harm is a massive problem and everybody is really worried about it, it does get better as kids get older. Even so, I have to say that when I found out that self-harm in our data set was so much more prevalent in 11 to 13-year-olds, I really wanted to try and find out why that was. And so I sort of started digging into the academic research to look at what was really going on. And there is emerging consensus on this issue, which suggests that neurodevelopmental changes in adolescence make young people much more susceptible to negative social cues, such as social exclusion and rejection. If you think about how young children are, they're not really aware of other people's thoughts and feelings and what other people think of them. But as children move into puberty, they become much more self-conscious, much more aware of what other people think about them. From a neurodevelopmental perspective, in adolescence, it seems that the parts of the brain that are responsible for processing socio-affective information go into overdrive. So adolescents become hypersensitive to peer acceptance and rejection. And that happens just as they're having to navigate the really complex social situations of those early years in secondary schools. I think all teachers agree that year 8 girls are the absolute worst. And that, in parallel with these neurodevelopmental changes, makes it really difficult for certain kids. So, in adolescence, emotional stressors become more acutely salient, and sensitivity to social threat then increases exponentially. And it means that, young people in years 7, 8, and 9 are much more vulnerable to the pain of social rejection, social exclusion, and hurt feelings. You can see here in this diagram that, actually being able to deal with those issues is part of normal adaptation in a teenager. But when you add in the compounding factors that we've discussed earlier, such as bullying or being LGBT or having difficulties at home, the combination of the neurodevelopmental change and those confounding factors increases the likelihood that young people are going to self-harm. Other studies have looked at how social rejection and physical pain are experienced in the brain, and it turns out that they use the same brain systems, and so the overlap between the two things is much less distinct than you might imagine. So that brings us to a cycle where you can see how a young person who might have certain disadvantages or difficult life experiences or very low self-esteem is then at the point around adolescence experiencing everyday problems with peers, and these are exacerbated by their neurodevelopmental hypersensitivity to things like rejection or social exclusion, which obviously creates feelings of anxiety and loneliness and depression and makes them very critical of themselves. And then self-harm becomes a coping mechanism as well as a form of self-punishment. And as we've seen, it does bring some temporary relief, but it also leads to feelings of guilt and shame. And those negative feelings are then compounded by difficult life experiences and low self-esteem, and the whole cycle starts all over again. Our data over the last 18 months through COVID has also been very interesting. And so I thought what I'd do was just try and map our data on self-harm onto data for things like anxiety. But here, this slide shows just looking at self-harm and taking the different age groups. So the blue line is 11 to 13-year-olds, the red line is 14 to 16-year-olds, and the yellow line is 17 to 19-year-olds. And you can see here, if we just look at the 11 to 13-year-olds, you can see how when the pink lines are the start of lockdown and the green lines are the end of lockdown. When the first lockdown was announced, self-harm rose, but then as kids got used to being at home, it really fell very, very dramatically. And then here, this corresponds with May 10th, when the PM announced a conditional plan for lifting the lockdown. And you can see that the posts about self-harm immediately started to go up and carried on going up through the period where everybody was back at school. And then in September, the PM announced new restrictions and self-harm dropped. In the second lockdown, there was a brief period where things opened up again, but that was in the middle of the Christmas holidays as well. So things stayed relatively stable until the lockdown in January, where things dropped again. And then the minute we came out of that lockdown, things shot up again. And I think we have always seen in our data that anxiety peaks just before school start. And we always thought that that was anxiety about going back to school. But when we dig down into that data, what we see is that a lot of it is about social issues. It's about friendships that have changed over the holiday and uncertainty about peer groups going back to school. And this suggests that actually the time out from school has been helpful for a lot of young people who self-harm, as it's taken some of that pressure off them. This is mapping anxiety onto self-harm. So the blue line is anxiety, and you can see here that it peaks before self-harm peaks. It peaks here, just behind self-harm, and again it peaks here after the end of the last lockdown. Moods map on pretty well as well to emotions and moods, which have changed through the 18 months. Whereas if we look at depression, it has really tailed off. And I can't really explain that. I really need to dig down into that data a bit more to work out what's going on there. So what can we do to prevent self-harm? I think from what we've learnt, what you need to definitely do is assume that it's happening in your class. Whether you go by the data from the Millennium Cohort Study or the YouGov study, roughly 1 in 4 young people is self-harming. Therefore, it's safe to assume that, you know, a quarter of any class may be self-harming. So in the same way that Ofsted is now saying that schools should assume that sexual assault is happening, you should also assume that self-harm is happening. And you should also focus on the early years, in years 7 to 10, when these neurodevelopmental changes are happening and it's actually at its peak. That's where you need to intervene to provide support and work around prevention. I'll just show you, this is our risk level data. Within the app, posts that are level 1 to 3 go through to the feed for peer support, but these are the severe and urgent posts. And again, they're all concentrated in the early years, 11 to 13. So moving forward, you need to do everything you can to increase connectedness and limit bullying and cliquiness and exclusion within the classroom. And trying to get people to mix and educating young people about the absolute fundamental importance of kindness and inclusion. We've been working with a school and they've come up with this really brilliant scheme to use peer mentoring to help the younger kids. They create these peer mentoring groups, and so research around talking about feelings, I just need to mention this, shows that just talking about feelings doesn't really help. In fact, it can have a negative effect. But if you talk about feelings in a solution-focused way, so in a problem-solving way, it's actually really beneficial to young people. And intuitively, these peer mentors have figured out a way of doing that in a really great way. So they get together as a group with the younger students, and they use the app, and they take posts off the app, and then they talk in a group about possible solutions or advice to give that young person, and then they post it into the app, and then they have a conversation called I Have a Friend, where young people can talk about an issue that a friend might be going through, and then they all come up with solutions and advice for that friend. And it's a great way of creating a sort of a solution-focused way of talking about very difficult things, and creating a kind of a stealth education around self-care and mental health. Obviously, as the summer holidays come and young people are can be very isolated over the summer, the Me Too app is a really good place for them to be able to talk about anything that's on their mind. But for all of you teachers out there, I just want to share this news with you, which is that our recent independent evaluation by the Anna Freud Centre found statistically significant evidence of improved well-being, confidence, connectedness, and knowledge about managing mental health in young people who use the Me Too app. Don't panic. Self-harm is a scary thing, and we know from lots of research that teachers think it's the most difficult thing to talk about. And we also know that a lot of you haven't had any mental health training. 40% in our study had no mental health training at all in the last year, and 20% had had half a day, and nearly 60% didn't feel equipped to support the mental health and well-being needs of their students. And because we know teachers are struggling, we've created the Me Too Connect app for everybody who works in a school. So there's peer support anonymously, and then an amazing directory of resources, training, education, as well as support for students. And it's free for anyone who works in a school. So I hope that you will download it, and I hope that I'll see you there soon. Thank you. You're on mute.
Honestly, how long have we been doing this for? I was saying, thank you very much. That was just fascinating and upsetting, all in equal measure. But it raised some really interesting questions. So I know for our viewers, please do, or if you're listening and you have any questions, please pop them in the Slido and we'll be able to ask them. But one thing I wanted to just check with you. So we know that peer approval is so important during this phase. Yeah. So does what we say as adults and educators, parents, really make a difference in terms of making students feel, or is it all about the peers?
Actually, peers are more important than parents, than teachers at this point in their life. As kids get a bit older, they become more independent. They're more rational about the influence of their peers. And I think any teacher can see that in a school. You can see that it's really most difficult in those early years, particularly year 8. That seems to be a key point. And then as friendship groups cement and people have their social structure and they begin to become more confident and they're achieving on their own, all of these things become protective factors in their own right. I mean, obviously, having a supportive family, having teachers you can talk to. Teachers are the number one, they're the first point of contact for anybody who's got a mental health issue. They're the number one place that young people will go if they have a problem, as in a real world point of contact. So teachers are massively important, but for me, it was just really interesting, this discovery. The shock of seeing how young it was all happening, and then realizing that there are biological factors at play. So it isn't just that, kids are freaking out because they're struggling with the transition to secondary school. There are actually neurodevelopmental changes. And if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, a young child is leaving their parents, and they're starting to become independent. And so it would make sense that they would be acutely aware of social threat. They need to be accepted at that point. But in evolutionary terms, it made sense in one way, but now in the modern world, it's a very different thing, and it creates these sort of barriers to peer inclusion.
So I guess it's really about thinking about the way we speak to the students in the classroom, mindful of how other kids might pick up on it and where it could be used for, to be made fun of later on.
I think ultimately, obviously the focus is all on exams and getting results, but really creating a culture of collaboration and community and kindness in those early years, and really, really stressing the importance of inclusion. I know that teachers are actually, a lot of people, 97% of kids think that they should be taught about things like self-harm in schools, but because of safeguarding policies and the fear of contagion, they won't be talked about. But what you can do is make it very clear how damaging it can be when kids are left out. And I think that it's really hard for teachers to keep an eye on all of that. But if you start really early, start with the year 7s and make that an absolute focus, you can stave off some of the negative things that might happen without that kind of guidance.
Okay. Well, that's amazing. Well, I've got some questions. I need to get my glasses on to try and read these. But okay, this first one is talking about eating disorders in young men being a real issue and growing rapidly. Do we need to deal with boys differently to girls?
I think eating disorders is a massive issue, and again, in a way like self-harm, and we did a lot of work on this. And boys, I mean, to be honest, the overlap between eating disorders and self-harm is so big that people are not even sure whether eating disorders should be looked at in their own right. But boys do things like they will exercise. They will do 4 hours of punishing exercise a day, steroid abuse. So they don't necessarily manifest in the same ways as they do in girls, but they're equally damaging. And everybody is aware that they're very much overlooked. I think boys in general, boys' mental health is being overlooked. And that's why yesterday I was at Epsom School with those peer mentors, and it's amazing to see boys taking on mental health for themselves, getting involved, setting up these talking groups in a mixed school, helping the younger kids. I mean, it's really exciting. And I think that when you get the young people on board, so it becomes their project and they're invested in it, I think that's probably the best way forward.
Yeah, I guess, and looking also at that boys possibly particularly don't always communicate through their mouth. So, you know, looking at all forms of behaviour as a form of communication.
Yeah. Well,
and I mean, mentors would be able to talk you through that as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a boy is going to see it much more readily, and another boy is going to see it much more readily.
Exactly.
And I mean, we've had boys who said, nobody seems to realise that what I'm doing to myself is actually killing me. They just think I'm really healthy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that talking is never more important. Okay, there's another colleague here who's actually concerned about their own colleagues and saying that, you know, what can we do to look out for our colleagues? I'm concerned about some of mine after the year that they've had, and gosh, I'm sure that resonates with all our audience.
Well, I mean, that's why we've made the app for teachers, because we realized we did this survey, and we were actually going out to find out how well teachers were going to be able to support students when they went back to school. And what we realized was that teachers were just 93% of them said they've never been more stressed in their life. So we started building this app for teachers, and it's peer support. It's got the amazing directory of, you know, crisis support, education, training, resources, and resources for students, and it's free. So I would say, let's build that community and let's get teachers on there so that they can offload anonymously. I think one of the other things that came out from our research was the fact that teachers didn't feel they could be open within the school environment about how they were feeling. There was, you know, concerns about how it would impact on their job, but also that it just didn't seem appropriate for them to bring their mental health to school. And so being able to do it privately is you know, hopefully, we're hoping it will be really helpful for everybody.
That's very typical of teachers, and they're probably concerned that they don't want to look after their own mental health because they're more worried about their students. And that's perhaps why I really like this concept of being able to talk to other people in the same boat as you, but with the sort of blanket of security and not anonymity, rather, that might make people feel a bit more secure in sharing.
I think the irony is, of course, that the people who were the most stressed are the heads of the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been hopefully we'll onwards and upwards in this next year. Now, this next question is talking about, what's the number one resource you would suggest we use in terms of being proactive in tackling and spotting issues early? And I guess there's two. When we think about proactivity, we talk in our schools about this, our Be Well chart, that talk about putting all the things in. So there's enough opportunity to connect and do things and give and sleep and diet next. So there's that level of proactivity that schools can contribute to a lot. But I think this question is perhaps more about being proactive in tackling issues, not quite at that early stage, but once they start developing.
Well, I mean, one of the problems with something like self-harm is that, as I was saying, it becomes a cycle. It's a coping mechanism. And so it's really quite difficult for young people to stop. And being told to stop isn't necessarily going to work. I mean, kids who are actively self-harming on a regular basis, particularly if they're ending up in A&E, that they need to be in therapy. There's some evidence that dialectical behavioural therapy is the most effective form of therapy. Weirdly, I found a study that suggested that fish oils is helpful. I don't know why. I haven't read into it, but that the reality is, when somebody is self-harming to that extent, they need professional help. And schools have their own safeguarding policies around things like notifying parents, etc. And I understand all of that, but the problem with that is that kids won't say that they're self-harming because they don't want to set that process in train. They have a coping mechanism which they know the minute they admit to it will be taken away from them. You know, it'll be complete lockdown for them. And until they feel psychologically ready to do that, they're not going to ask for help. However, I will say that in our experience, young people who talk about these things on the app, and that's exactly what came out in the independent evaluation, was when they start to talk about it anonymously with people who won't say to them, oh, just stop, but they will offer them tips and tricks and techniques and ways to get through the 15 minutes and emotional support. Most importantly, being able to talk openly, anonymously, and get emotional support. What that does is it builds up their confidence, and they begin to believe that they can stop. They have peer support from people who've been in exactly the same situation and have managed to stop, and that gives them confidence to give it a try, and then they gradually begin to manage it on their own. And as you can see, it also aligns with just growing up, just getting older, becoming more confident and more independent. So it's not easy, and that's why getting in early before it starts is and educating around all the things that you can change before they happen is probably the best bet.
Yeah, so it's sort of a two-pronged, you know, the allowing them to get that peer support is important. And I like the fact that it's pre-moderated, because sometimes I have to be honest, when I first thought, oh my gosh, you know, goodness knows, what if a child posted something vulnerable and then the reply wasn't helpful? So, you know, it's moderated.
So the app is also age banded. So young people only see posts from people who are 2 years either side of their age, and that band then goes up the app as they grow up. And we have a team of counsellors who deal with anything more severe. Anything more severe doesn't go through to the app. It gets dealt with behind the scenes by a counsellor. But I do think we have to trust our young people. You know, they are really good at supporting each other when they're given the chance. And they do amazing work. So 85% of all the interactions on the app are peer-to-peer. And then we have a team of psychologists who are in there just to make sure that nobody gets left out and nobody ever posts a question that doesn't get a reply. But the quality of the advice that they give each other is phenomenal.
And perhaps I guess that we know how important relationships are with our students, and actually teaching our teachers about the neuroscience, you know, just helps make that, you know, because teenagers can be challenging sometimes, and actually at least understanding a bit about what's going on, you know, in their brains and their developments can give you a little bit more resolve to try and find a different solution and like get a better relationship. So when they're ready, you know, they can perhaps come and guide you for help.
I felt when I read that research, it just a light bulb went on, and I thought, so that's why my teenage daughter wants me to drop her around the corner from the school so that she doesn't get seen with me, or why kids are hypersensitive to things. It makes complete sense. It's intuitive. So it's very nice to see it actually written down in academia.
Yes. No, it can apply to so much, and you know, when you're having that, you know, argument with a student in school, and actually they really should be apologizing for something they've done, you'd have a much better chance of doing that away from their friends, because they might want to apologize, but just you know, they're not going to do it because the social rejection of apologizing in front of everybody would be too much.
Yeah, it's something that I'm planning to do a lot more research into it, because I think it's the key to an awful lot of things, not just to self-harm. I think the whole peer support network, and trying to find the ways in which it can be toxic and then work out the ways where it can be really beneficial. It's all that iterative process, which is how we kind of keep improving what we're doing.
Well, Suzi, I'm going to try and squeeze these two questions in. I think so I've just downloaded the app. It is really excellent and easy to navigate. Yes, here. Are the supports available? I really need to get glasses. Based in England, or are they also available to those in Scotland, and I presume in Wales and Ireland as well?
Yeah, it's for anyone, anywhere. Anybody can use it. And all the moderators are based in England and Ireland, but they all work remotely.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if you downloaded the kids app or the teachers app.
So for teachers, it is really easy to download. And I know that if any schools or teachers want to have a conversation to learn a little bit more, then you're always happy to talk things through, because it is quite a novel way of offering that support. So I think it's probably good to ask questions first. Okay, well, I think that is the last of it. It's been a fascinating session, Suzi, for all sorts of reasons. I think that the way that our young people are suffering and have been suffering all over, all over the world. It's been a tough year. But even before the pandemic, I think it's difficult to be a teenager, and so any sort of support we can, or broader support. So my messages I've taken from you today have been, number one, really build on those relationships and connecting with students, and how you can improve that within school context, inside and outside the classroom. Give them the opportunity to peer support, within their school. It doesn't have to be through the app. But third, if you did the app, that would, if they started getting used to that model, then they may be able to take that into their own schools.
We've definitely seen an increase in the way young people access real world support by building up their confidence, and that's really important, because it just takes that persuasion from their peers, and then they make that decision to ask their mum, their dad, their teacher, or their counsellor.
Yeah, and we'll have our moment again, I'm sure, for young people when they're in their 20s, parents, teachers will become more credible once more. So look, Suzi, thank you so much. It's just so much information to take on, but I really do hope that people go and find out more about Me Too. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well Charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well Charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have 1 or 2 or 3 all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.